I knew something in my life had shattered the moment I felt the ground slip from beneath everything I trusted. It was not a loud moment or a dramatic fallout, but a quiet, precise kind of devastation that cuts deeper because it arrives from the place you thought was safest. That first crack never really stays small. It widens, crawls through every memory, and redraws everything you believed about loyalty and love. I did not realize it then, but that was the beginning of a truth I could no longer outrun, and the story I'm finally ready to tell. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from all over the world. Your comments create a community where storytelling thrives, and we're so grateful to have you here. If you have not already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a journey that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Let us get started. My name is Margaret Ellis, and when I think back to the months before everything changed, I remember the soft tide of Savannah, Georgia, and how peaceful my mornings used to be. I was 63 years old, recently retired after spending more than 3 decades working as a senior care nurse. I was not wealthy, but I lived simply and comfortably in a small rented seaside cottage that smelled of salt, lavender, and fresh soil from my tiny garden. My days used to begin with warm tea on the porch, the rustling sound of marsh grasses in the wind, and the distant call of gulls drifting across pink morning skies. I often said life had become gentler with age, like a quilt finally softened by years of washing and wear. I had been a widow for almost 12 years, ever since my husband, Thomas, passed after a quiet battle with heart failure. His absence no longer crushed me the way it once did, but it remained a permanent shadow that could settle without warning. In his place, I found new purpose in small, steady routines. I tended basil, rosemary, and wildflowers along the fence, read mystery novels from the library, and kept a journal filled with tiny observations that no one else ever saw. I told myself loneliness was only a word, and that solitude was something I had earned. My son, Daniel Harper, lived halfway across the country in Denver, Colorado. He had grown into a confident, successful man working in the technology industry and was married to a woman named Vanessa, whom I only truly knew through holiday visits. When Daniel was young, he and I had been inseparable. I raised him mostly alone after Thomas died, working double shifts, skipping meals, and tucking hope into every corner of our small life. I used to think he saw it, really saw it. But children rarely understand the shape of a parent's sacrifice until they become parents themselves. As the years moved on, Daniel and I lived separate but respectful lives. Then his phone calls began to arrive more often, filled with stories of stress, deadlines, and exhaustion from raising 2 energetic children. His words seemed full of longing for support, which warmed something dormant in me. He told me how much he missed having a family close. He said that children needed grandparents to grow up balanced. He said that life felt too heavy and rushed. The thought of being needed again made my chest ache with a mixture of fear and sweetness. I began to imagine helping with homework, baking cinnamon muffins, brushing little heads of hair, feeling laughter echo through rooms that had long been quiet. I told myself that if life was offering another chance at closeness, I should not let fear decide. My seaside cottage felt like a sanctuary, but sometimes sanctuaries can become hiding places. I once sat outside at dusk, watching the tide creep toward the rocks, and wondered if I had already lived the best chapters of my life. The answer scared me enough to consider change. The air smelled of salt and evening rain, and the porch light flickered as if urging me to move before it was too late. That same night, I found an old photograph of Daniel when he was 5 years old, smiling with missing teeth and holding my hand like I was the whole world. I traced the shape of his tiny face with my thumb and whispered, "I am still here." I did not know that life was preparing to test every corner of my faith, trust, and identity, one fragile layer at a time. If you are still watching and this moment struck you, please comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now let us move on to the next chapter and see how the tension quietly begins to build. In the weeks that followed, my quiet cottage no longer felt as still as before. There was a subtle stirring inside my mind. Like wind brushing lightly through curtains that had been closed for years, Daniel began calling almost every other evening, sometimes while driving home, sometimes late at night when the children were asleep. His voice sounded strained in a way that suggested not only fatigue, but also expectation, as if he was gently preparing the ground for something he wanted me to accept before I fully realized I had already agreed. He spoke with warm familiarity, yet there was a new rhythm to his sentences that leaned heavily on responsibility, performance, and what he called practical living. I noticed it, but I chose not to dwell on it. When the heart hopes, the mind often softens its grip. He described long work hours, rushed dinners, and the constant noise of homework, school projects, and weekly errands. I imagined a household spinning like a carousel that never stopped, and I pictured myself stepping in with calm hands and slow breaths, offering steadiness, patience, and care. The idea planted itself so quickly that I did not notice how deeply it rooted. Each call seemed to contain a sentence that wrapped itself around my emotions. He would mention how children grew fast, how time slipped away, and how grandparents played important roles in stable families. If I had been more objective, I might have recognized that his words focused less on connection and more on contribution. Instead, I felt my sense of purpose awakening like an old song drifting back into memory. One afternoon, I shared my thoughts with my neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, while we sat outside folding laundry and enjoying the mild salt air. She was a thoughtful woman with soft silver curls and a habit of speaking slowly as if her words deserved careful placement. When I told her that I was thinking of moving to Denver, her brows lifted ever so slightly. She reminded me that roots, no matter how modest, provided safety. She asked whether I was truly needed or simply useful. I laughed softly, insisting that love was the reason, not expectation. She did not argue, but she placed her hand gently on mine and squeezed as if to pass a silent warning wrapped in kindness. I tried to dismiss her concern, but it lingered like the aftertaste of strong tea. At night, I lay in bed listening to the ocean pulse against the shore. While my thoughts moved in circles, I feared losing independence, yet feared loneliness even more. I loved the life I had created, but I had built it alone. And there were moments when quiet felt too heavy, like an unanswered letter, waiting forever. The choice in front of me did not feel like a question of comfort, but a question of identity. Was I still a mother with purpose, or an aging woman with fading relevance? The answer mattered more than I wanted to admit. A few days later, Daniel sent me a photograph of the children, both smiling brightly, holding a sign that read, "We miss you, Grandma." Beneath the image, he wrote that they needed stability and structure, and that I could make everything feel balanced again. That small message tipped the scale inside me. I began to gather empty boxes and fold away belongings I once believed would always stay with me. I walked outside and looked at my garden, noticing new buds that I would not see open. As dark clouds gathered at the edge of the sky, I understood that change had already begun. Even before I said it aloud, I returned to my desk, opened a blank document, and drafted the first line of my lease termination notice. Unaware of the deeper cost attached to the choice I had just made. If you are still watching and this twist caught your attention, please comment number 2 below so I know you are following along. Now let us step into the next chapter where the pressure rises even more. Leaving Savannah felt like peeling away the final layer of a life that had kept me steady. I turned in my lease, boxed my books, folded my gardening tools into a small cloth bag, and donated most of my furniture to a nearby charity shop. The cottage looked strangely hollow once everything was packed, as if it had become a place I was only visiting rather than the home that had carried my grief, my recovery, and my quiet joy. I locked the door with slow hands, stood for a moment on the small porch, and whispered a silent farewell to the waves and the wind that had been my closest companions. I told myself that I was trading loneliness for belonging, that I was choosing purpose over safety, and that courage sometimes looked like surrender. Daniel encouraged me to streamline my finances before moving. He spoke confidently about how shared funds would make things easier when paying for travel, medical costs, groceries, or unexpected expenses. He said that life worked better when family acted as one unit rather than separate islands. I knew little about financial systems beyond basic savings and retirement plans, so I trusted what sounded like modern wisdom. With his guidance, I transferred the money I had saved over many years into an account that allowed him administrative access. It felt strange, like handing over a key to a locked drawer that contained not only money, but decades of sacrifice. Still, I reminded myself that trust is the foundation of family, and fear has no place in love. The trip to Denver was long and filled with mixed emotions. The airport felt colder than usual, not because of temperature, but because I was stepping away from familiarity without knowing where I would land emotionally. When I finally walked through the arrival gate, Daniel greeted me with a smile that looked tight around the edges, and Vanessa offered a polite hug that felt more rehearsed than spontaneous. Outside, the city felt louder, sharper, and more hurried than Savannah. Rows of modern houses, high-traffic streets, and distant mountains created a landscape that did not hold the softness I had been used to. Their home was large and stylish, with tall windows and polished floors. I expected a guest room filled with fresh linens, maybe a small vase of flowers, something that said welcome. Instead, Daniel guided me downstairs to a small basement room, explaining that it was temporary until they reorganized. The room held a narrow bed, a metal shelf, and sat only a few steps from the laundry machines. The air smelled faintly of detergent and damp cement. For a moment, disappointment flickered inside me, but I buried it beneath gratitude. They were opening their home. I should not demand luxury. I repeated this like a quiet prayer until it sounded sensible. In the days following my arrival, I slipped naturally into the rhythm of the household. I cooked breakfast, washed dishes, folded children's clothes, packed lunchboxes, swept floors, and reminded myself that helping was a privilege, not a burden. However, appreciation slowly faded into expectation, and expectation slowly turned into silence. No one commented on my effort. No one acknowledged the hours. I told myself that love did not always speak with praise, and that true value sometimes lived quietly in the background. One afternoon, while tidying the living room, I noticed a stack of envelopes and papers on the side table. Among them was a banking statement with financial details that did not match the amount I remembered transferring. Another document referenced a business name I had never heard before, Harper Solutions Private Investments. Confusion tightened in my chest, but I convinced myself that everything must have an explanation. That night, as I lay in my basement bed, listening to the machines hum and spin through the darkness, a thin thread of doubt coiled quietly around my thoughts. I whispered that it was only an adjustment, but my heart no longer agreed with that complete certainty. If you are still watching and felt the shift in the story, please comment number 3 below to show you are still here. Now let us continue to the next chapter where intentions start to unravel. The uneasy feeling that began as a quiet thought soon settled into my mind, like a draft slipping under a closed door. Days passed, yet the image of those financial documents did not fade. I continued with my chores, preparing breakfast, wiping counters, packing school items, and folding laundry. But my thoughts were no longer anchored in the rhythm of caregiving. Each task felt slightly heavier, as if my hands were occupied, but my mind wandered down corridors of unanswered questions. I reminded myself that suspicion could destroy trust, and trust was the only thing holding my new life together. Still, I could not ignore the quiet alarm sounding from somewhere deep inside. When the family left for school and work one morning, the house finally fell into complete stillness. I sat alone at the dining table with my tea cooling between my palms. The basement room felt too confining for clear thinking, so I stayed upstairs, trying to convince myself that uncertainty was simply part of change. Yet I knew that clarity never came from wishing. It came from looking. With a deep breath, I brought my old laptop from the basement and opened it slowly, as if the screen itself could judge my intentions. I searched through my email history, scrolling past travel plans, holiday greetings, discount advertisements, and digital receipts until I found a message from Daniel titled, "Convenient signatures for efficiency attached," was the same document I had vaguely remembered signing. The description said that my signature would allow smoother transactions during relocation, but when I examined the file closely, I realized it was more complex than I had understood. The document granted him partial financial authority, not merely logistical permission. My pulse quickened. I remembered feeling overwhelmed by digital paperwork during that period. I had not wanted to appear helpless, so I signed what he presented, trusting the love between us to fill the gaps of understanding. Now, reading the language with slower eyes, I saw phrases involving financial discretion and investment involvement. I wanted to believe that everything was innocent, that nothing harmful was intended, but the foundation beneath my trust felt thinner than I had realized. As I stared at the screen, an old memory surfaced from my years working at the senior care center. I had once met a woman named Georgia, an attorney who helped an elderly resident review confusing legal forms. She had been professional, kind, and patient. I had kept her business card tucked in my wallet, not because I thought I would ever need it, but because something in her tone suggested she understood the quiet fears that older adults sometimes carried. My heart beat harder at the thought. I searched through my purse, and there the card was, slightly bent but readable. I slipped outside onto the small backyard patio where I would not be overheard. The air was brisk, and the dry autumn leaves scraped gently across the concrete. With hesitant fingers, I dialed the number. When she answered, I introduced myself slowly, explaining that I needed guidance about a situation involving family finances. As I spoke, I kept my tone measured, though emotion pressed heavily against my chest. Her voice remained calm and professional. She asked me to gather any financial statements, email attachments, and signed forms so she could examine them. Her measured concern struck me harder than if she had spoken with alarm. After ending the call, I remained outside for a long moment, staring across the fenced yard toward the neighboring homes. Inside my chest, something shifted. It felt like the very first acknowledgement that this was not just confusion, but a possible threat disguised as cooperation. That night, after finishing chores, I began writing small notes in my journal, recording dates, transactions, and changes in household dynamics. I did not know exactly what I was preparing for, but an instinct guided my hand. When I finally returned to my basement room, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the steady hum of the laundry machines again, only this time the sound did not seem domestic. It sounded like machinery running beneath a locked door that I was just beginning to open. If you are still watching, and the story is pulling you in deeper, please comment number 4 below to let me know. Now, let us move on and see how everything edges closer to breaking point. By the end of the week, the weight inside my chest felt too heavy to carry in silence. I had spoken with the attorney, gathered copies of documents, and filled several pages of my journal with dates, notes, and observations. Still, I hoped that an honest and calm conversation might resolve everything without bitterness. I told myself that families could repair misunderstandings if they chose gentleness over pride. Wanting to create a warm and welcoming atmosphere, I planned a full dinner, believing that comfort on the table could soften the edges of difficult words. I spent the afternoon preparing dishes that held strong memories for all of us. I roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes with cream and butter, steamed green beans tossed with a bit of olive oil, and baked a small apple pie with cinnamon the way my husband once loved. The scent filled the kitchen and drifted up the stairs, bringing with it a feeling of home that I prayed would reach every member of the household. It was not only food, but a quiet plea that love might still find its way through the cracks. When everyone gathered around the table, the children were cheerful, unaware of any change in the air. Their laughter floated above the table like bubbles, fragile and fleeting. Vanessa looked tired and kept glancing at her phone, though she tried to smile politely. Daniel appeared rushed, as if he had already counted the minutes he could spend seated before moving on to something more important. I took my place quietly, folding my napkin in my lap to keep my hands from trembling. Before anyone began eating, I gathered my courage. My words came slowly, chosen with care, shaped by both love and fatigue. I spoke about how my body felt tired from continuous housework, how I hoped to join a local senior group or find a small schedule outside the home. I explained that I wanted clarity about the financial arrangements, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I no longer understood what decisions had been made. I expressed that after spending my entire adult life providing for others, I wished to maintain at least a portion of independence, dignity, and peace. At first, I expected empathy. Instead, I saw a visible shift in Daniel's expression. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened, and a shadow crossed his eyes as if I had broken an unspoken rule. The air around the table changed. The children stopped moving, sensing the heaviness. Vanessa lowered her gaze, as if she already knew where the conversation might lead and had chosen silence over involvement. Daniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was cool and clipped. He reminded me of the help I was receiving by living in his home and spoke as if my presence was part of a system rather than a relationship. He described obligations disguised as gratitude and expectations disguised as family order. The tone sliced through the room, leaving no space for tenderness. Then came the words that would echo in my mind long after the plates were cleared. He stated that I was here to help, not to rest, and that if I disagreed, then I should leave. The sentence hung in the air like a suspended blade, cutting through the fragile place where love and dependence meet. For a moment, everything became still. The sound of forks and knives ceased. The children's eyes widened with confusion and fear. Vanessa remained silent, staring down at her hands. A cold sensation spread through my body, beginning at my fingertips and rising slowly to my throat. My mind struggled to process the scene, but my heart understood immediately. I realized that in this house, I was not seen as a mother, not even as a guest, but as a resource whose value depended on labor and compliance. My breath grew shallow as humiliation pressed against my ribs. I did not respond. The silence became my only shield. I lowered my gaze, placed my hands on my lap, and sat motionless while the warmth drained from the room. In that moment, something inside me quietly cracked, like porcelain under strain, a sound only I could hear. That night, I did not sleep. I lay on the narrow bed in the basement with my eyes open, staring into the dim ceiling as if it held answers that had been hidden from me for far too long. The sentence I had heard at dinner replayed in my mind with painful clarity, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. It did not sound like a heat-of-the-moment remark or a slip of frustration. It sounded like a rule, spoken by someone who believed he had the right to define my worth. I felt a heaviness in my chest that no deep breath could lift. I had spent a lifetime believing that love was unbreakable and that sacrifice was a natural part of motherhood. But now I began to wonder if unquestioned sacrifice could become a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. The next day, when everyone left the house, I stepped outside with my phone, walked to the far end of the small backyard, and called Georgia. My voice trembled slightly as I shared exactly what had been said at the table. She listened silently, allowing me to finish without interruption. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady and professional, yet gentle enough to keep me from collapsing into tears. She explained that although disrespect from family was painful, this situation appeared to stretch beyond emotional mistreatment into potential financial and psychological exploitation. She reminded me that financial authority carried serious consequences and that I might be legally responsible for debts or transactions I had never chosen. When the call ended, the air around me felt colder, as if the truth itself had dropped the temperature. I returned inside feeling as if I were floating through someone else's life. Every wall, every shadow, and every household item looked different, as if I were seeing them through a new and unforgiving lens. For years, I had thought that patience was a virtue, that endurance proved loyalty, and that silence prevented conflict. Now I wondered if silence simply fed harm. Still, the thought of confronting Daniel through legal avenues felt like betraying a bond that was supposed to last beyond all storms. I could not ignore the fear of losing him forever, yet I also could not ignore the fear of losing myself completely. Later that afternoon, while I folded towels in the laundry room, I heard soft footsteps behind me. It was Vanessa. She closed the door quietly and sat down, her shoulders rounded as if she were carrying invisible weight. She began speaking slowly, almost whispering, saying that she had overheard part of the conversation the night before and wanted to speak honestly. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. She admitted that she too had experienced control, but had endured it silently to protect the children and avoid emotional eruption. She revealed that financial decisions had been made without her consent, including the use of her credit and the children's education savings. When she handed me printed emails and screenshots from their shared documents, my heart dropped. Among them, I saw a message in which Daniel referred to my money as usable capital, accompanied by the claim that I was unlikely to challenge anything legally or emotionally. The words stung with brutal clarity. For a long moment, I could not speak. Not because of shock alone, but because something inside me shifted permanently. This was no misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and I was not the only person caught in it. In that instant, the battle between guilt and self-preservation ended. I realized that protecting myself was not betrayal, but necessity. It was also the only chance of protecting the innocent. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the edge of my mattress and wrote one final sentence in my journal. Remaining silent is no longer an act of love. Then, with steady hands, I packed a small bag and hid it beneath the bed. I no longer wondered whether I should leave. I knew that the real question was how soon. If you are still watching and that choice made your heart tighten, please comment number 6 below so I know you are with me. Now let us move on to Chapter 7, where the consequences come into full view. The morning I decided to leave did not feel dramatic or cinematic. It was strangely quiet, like the calm after a heavy snowstorm when the world is muffled by a thick white blanket. I woke up before anyone else, sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest room, and stared at the wall for several long minutes while breathing slowly. My hands rested on my knees, steady for the first time in weeks, and I realized that stillness was not weakness, but confirmation. I was no longer undecided. My choice had already been made inside me, and now my body was simply catching up to the truth I already knew. I packed only what belonged to me, carefully folding each item into 2 small suitcases. Not one thing from that house felt like mine anymore. Not even the family photographs hanging along the hallway. I did not take jewelry, valuable kitchenware, or anything that could be argued about later. I took my clothes, a framed picture of my late mother, a worn shawl with the lavender scent, and a leather-bound journal I had owned for years. I left behind every trace that could be used to accuse me of theft, pettiness, or emotional manipulation. I wanted my exit to be as clean and unarguable as possible. Before leaving, I called Georgia from the downstairs bathroom with the shower running to cover the sound. She answered with a steady voice, ready to move forward. She had already arranged a temporary senior housing studio in a quiet part of town, where no one would know my name or story. She told me everything was ready and that I was making the right decision, but her tone remained gentle rather than triumphant. It was comforting to hear someone speak to me like an adult human being, rather than a convenient tool. After hanging up, I leaned against the cold tile and closed my eyes, letting the decision settle into my bones. I left the house shortly after sunrise. The sky was pale blue with a thin band of golden light stretching across the horizon. I placed a handwritten note on the kitchen table, written with calm and measured words. It explained that I was safe, that I was leaving by choice, and that any further communication would need to be appropriate and respectful. I did not mention where I was going, nor did I justify my reasons. My dignity did not require explanation. The ride to my temporary housing felt unreal. The car looked the same, the city looked the same, and yet everything inside me was changing at a speed I could barely comprehend. When I stepped into the studio apartment, I noticed the scent of freshly cleaned linoleum, the hum of an old refrigerator, and the faint chirping of birds outside the small window. It was not luxurious, but it was mine, and no one could order me to cook, wake up early, or sacrifice my needs to maintain household image. Later that afternoon, my cell phone buzzed repeatedly. Daniel had discovered I was gone. His messages ranged from demanding to insulting, then shifted into guilt laced with accusation. I placed the phone face down on the table and focused on the soft rhythm of my own breathing. There was no storm inside me, only quiet determination mixed with sadness. I was not running away. I was walking towards safety, identity, and self-worth. As night arrived, I sat by the small window and watched the faint glow of distant neighborhood lights. For the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like space to heal, and even though I knew challenges still waited, I finally believed I would face them not as a shadow, but as myself. The first morning I woke up in the small studio, I felt like my body was still searching for instructions that no one was giving anymore. There was no alarm set to match someone else's schedule. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no sizzling pan waiting on the stove, and no tasks silently assigned through expectation. Instead, there were soft rays of light coming through a cheap but clean curtain, and the slow hum of a refrigerator that sounded almost comforting. For a moment, I did not know if I was free or simply floating, but I knew I was not trapped. My heart felt sore, almost bruised, yet I could breathe with depth I had not felt in years. I spent the next few hours quietly organizing my new space. I folded my clothes into the single dresser, lined my shoes neatly, and placed my framed picture of my mother on the nightstand. I even laid my shawl across the back of the single armchair, like a gentle reminder that softness still belonged to me. I made a pot of tea and sat by the small window, allowing myself to feel everything without rushing into decisions. My mind tried to return to guilt, shame, and self-blame, but I began to question those automatic reactions. Why was I conditioned to apologize for saving myself? Why did I believe I owed endless labor and silence to be considered loving? Later that day, I opened my notebook and spread all the documents I had collected onto the table. Bank statements, transfer screenshots, copies of insurance forms, text messages that exposed entitlement, and notes I had written when things began to feel wrong. I organized them into folders labeled clearly. No longer overwhelmed but focused, I created a list titled Rights I Did Not Know I Had, and beneath it wrote bullet points: financial independence, bodily autonomy, emotional safety, and the right to refuse exploitation even from family. Seeing those words made my eyes sting, because they sounded simple but felt revolutionary. When afternoon came, I contacted the attorney who had previously offered guidance. I did not call from a place of panic, but from a place of strategy. I explained that I was no longer in immediate danger, and that I intended to pursue full protection rather than revenge. He suggested resources for elder financial abuse, directed me to support hotlines, and recommended documenting my timeline in chronological detail. I wrote for nearly 2 hours, remembering every moment I ignored instinct. By the time I finished, my hand ached, yet my thoughts felt clearer. That evening, Georgia visited briefly with grocery bags containing fresh fruit, canned soup, tea, and a loaf of soft bread. She spoke to me with the tone of someone who did not pity me, but respected my courage. She reminded me that healing was not a sprint, and that self-worth required building strong boundaries without apology. After she left, I sat in silence and allowed those words to settle. Healing did not mean pretending it never happened, and it did not mean waiting for someone else to validate my pain. Healing meant constructing a life where harm could not enter so easily again. Before going to bed, I lit a small candle I found in one of the kitchen drawers. It smelled faintly like chamomile. As I watched the flame flicker, I made a promise to myself that I would not let this experience define me only through suffering. I would learn, rebuild, and stand taller, not because I needed to prove anything to those who mistreated me, but because I intended to honor every version of myself that stayed silent in order to survive. That night, I slept without feeling owned, controlled, or monitored, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my future was mine to shape. If you are still watching and feeling the weight of what happens next, please comment number 8 below to let me know you are still here. Now let us move forward and uncover how everything finally comes together in the end. The days that followed formed a new kind of rhythm, one that did not revolve around serving anyone else, but instead marked the slow rebuilding of my own sense of self. Meetings with the attorney continued, and step by step, the tangled knots around my finances began to loosen. Legal documents were signed with careful explanations, not rushed instructions. I regained full access to my personal bank account, and a portion of the funds that had been transferred was restored. The process was not immediate, but it was real, and each completed step felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been taken without permission. An official investigation into potential elder financial exploitation was opened, which brought both fear and relief. Fear, because the truth was no longer silent relief, because silence had been the heaviest weight of all. I stopped responding to Daniel's calls and messages. They came frequently at first, shifting in tone from blame to anger and then to attempts at guilt. Some were filled with accusations, some with pleading, and some with just enough emotional manipulation to remind me of the trap I had escaped. I forwarded everything directly to my attorney, who advised me to maintain distance and minimal contact. My heart ached as I read his words, but I no longer believed that love required me to open my life to pain. There is a difference between forgiveness and access, and I was finally learning it. Vanessa contacted me once through a long message that arrived late in the evening. She apologized for remaining silent for so long and thanked me for having the courage to leave, saying that it opened her eyes to dangers she had normalized. She shared that she was making arrangements to protect herself and the children, and that she hoped one day they could visit me when life was calmer. I read her message with a heavy heart, but also with gratitude. Sometimes courage does not roar. Sometimes courage simply stands up once, and that one act becomes a light for someone else. My new life unfolded gently. I began attending a weekly support circle for older women who had experienced emotional abandonment, manipulation, or financial exploitation by people they trusted most. I listened to stories that echoed parts of my own, and I learned that I was not weak, foolish, or naive. I was human, and my love had been genuine. I joined a small community cooking class, borrowed books from a nearby library, and took slow morning walks without worrying about the next chore or criticism I felt myself returning, not as someone desperate for belonging, but as someone rediscovering personal worth. There were moments when sadness washed through me, moments when I wondered if things could have been different. Yet each time, I reminded myself that healing was not about rewriting the past, but about protecting the future. As spring approached, I stood outside one morning and felt the soft wind lift the ends of my shawl. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel like a burden, a tool, or a responsibility. I felt like a woman with a life still unfolding, and I whispered one quiet promise to myself: I will never disappear inside someone else's needs again. The morning light drifted gently across my new living space, quiet and unhurried, as if it understood that I needed time to breathe. I stood near the window, letting the brightness expand in front of me, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down on my shoulders. The stillness was not empty. It was comforting, a soft reminder that peace could exist even after long seasons of strain. As I looked out at the open street, I found myself retracing the path that had brought me here. I remembered the small dismissals, the raised voices, the moments when my presence in my own home felt like an interruption. None of it had exploded in one day. It had been a slow erosion, a quiet diminishing of my worth that I did not recognize until it was nearly complete. The incident in the kitchen had simply been the final push, the moment when everything sharpened into clarity. Leaving had not been an act of rebellion. It had been an act of survival. I learned that devotion becomes dangerous when it demands silence. Love loses its meaning when it requires the disappearance of the self. I had given everything because I believed that was what mothers do, but I realized that sacrifice without respect is not love at all. It is submission, and submission wears the soul thin. Now, in this new place, I was slowly reclaiming myself. I was learning that boundaries were not walls, but doorways that protected what mattered. Setting limits did not make me unkind. It made me whole. And as I rebuilt my days, I felt a quiet pride forming, something steady and calm. I had not chosen an easy path, but I had chosen an honest one. I did not hate anyone. I did not wish for punishment or regret from those who had hurt me. I simply wished for understanding, even if it never arrived. My life no longer depended on their acknowledgement. My life depended on my own courage to move forward. Outside, a soft breeze lifted through the trees, carrying the scent of early sunlight across the road. I closed my eyes, breathed it in, and allowed myself a small smile. This was not an ending. It was the beginning I had denied myself for far too long. And as I stood there, wrapped in the quiet, I finally felt the truth settle inside me. Choosing myself had never been the wrong choice. It had been the first right one in years. Every journey of healing begins the moment a person chooses truth over fear, and silence gives way to self-worth. In the quiet that follows hard choices, strength often appears in unexpected forms, reminding us that dignity is not something others give, but something we reclaim. Life has a way of reshaping itself when we finally draw boundaries that honor our spirit, opening space for peace to grow where exhaustion once lived. Even after seasons of disappointment, a new beginning can rise with remarkable clarity, proving that it is never too late to choose a path that leads back to oneself. If this story touched you or sparked your own reflections, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share your feelings in the comments, and remember to follow and subscribe so you will not miss the next story. Your voice truly keeps this space alive, and it means so much.